Hi everyone! Today's training is going to be about crawl errors and status codes. So status codes are server responses to a browser's request. So basically when you visit a website like Facebook and you're using a browser like Google Chrome or Safari, your browser sends a request to the site server, and the server then responds to the browser's request with a 3-digit code, which is the HTTP status code. So really this just communicates whether something is okay, whether something is wrong, and whether there's an error. There's a number of different tools that you can use to find out what an HTTP status code of a specific URL might be. The first is by using some Chrome extensions. So we've listed out two, one called the IAMA redirect path extension and another called the Spark Chrome extension. So these are essentially extensions that you put onto your browser, and it'll show you real time what the status code of that specific URL is. So it's really great for doing spot checks, but if you do need to find out the status codes of URLs on a much larger scale, the best way to do that is to crawl the website in question and get a list of all the status codes at once. So there are a number of different ways you can do this. If it's a site that Perfect Search has ownership of, you can use Google Search Console to see really quickly, the crawl status there. You can also use SEO Clarity to do a crawl. And then if it's a website that you don't have ownership of, maybe you're doing an audit or something, you can use Screaming Frog to crawl any site and quickly get a list of all of the status codes. So now we'll talk about different types of status codes and crawl errors. So the first one is 200 status code, meaning that it's a success. So basically what this is saying is that the request from the browser to the server was successfully completed and the server gave the browser the expected response. So this is the kind of status code that we want to see. When you see a URL that has a 200 status code, it means that page is able to be crawled, it's able to be indexed, and its equity is recognized by search engines. So best practices: any page on your website that you want to be picked up by search engines like Google or Bing, you want to make sure that all of those pages are 200 status. The next type of status code we'll talk about is 301 redirect or a permanent redirect. This means that the status of the page is that it's redirecting from one page to another. So the request was received by the server, but there is a redirect of some kind. So the implications of this are that the page is no longer crawled, it's no longer indexed, and the equity of this is passed along if it's a permanent redirect, but only 75 to 90%. Obviously, there are going to be some cases where you need to redirect one page to another. An example of this might be if you migrate your site from non-secure HTTP to secure HTTPS. Or maybe if you have an e-commerce site and you have an old product that you no longer sell and you need to redirect that page to the new product that you do sell. So there's nothing inherently wrong with having a 301 redirect. So best practices around this: you want to make sure that if there are any old pages, update all of the internal links on your website to point directly to that new URL. So in the case of the e-commerce website, if you have a new product page, make sure that any page that references the old product is now directly linking to the new product page. Another best practice around that is conducting outreach for high-value websites. So let's say that old product page was really valuable, really popular. There were a lot of articles, a lot of links that mentioned it. You'll want to conduct outreach, reach out to those websites, and make sure that they have the new URL to the new product. You want to make sure that you use this only in permanent circumstances. So in this case, there's no chance of that old product page coming back and you having to reverse that redirect. As much as possible, you want to try to match the intent and purpose of the old page to the new page. So, there can be a tendency for people to just try to blanket redirect all of the old pages on a site directly to the home page or something, which, while that can be easier, especially for the developer, it's not a great user experience for both humans and search engines. So if you think about when you've been on a website and you've clicked a page and it's just taken you to another page that doesn't actually match what you're trying to find, you might leave the site. And the same thing goes for a search engine. If they consistently find that many of your pages are just redirecting to another page that people are leaving, that could definitely hurt your page authority. Another best practice is that you want to avoid having a redirect chain. So essentially what this means is you have, page A redirecting to page B, which is redirecting to page C. You would want to skip B altogether and just have A go directly to C. And then finally, if you do have a page that's old and you're redirecting it, make sure you take that page out of your XML sitemap. And the reason for doing this is, by having a page that's going somewhere else, but also present in the XML sitemap, you're sending contradictory signals to search engines about the value of that page. So making sure that within the XML sitemap, there's only 200 status or OK pages. The next status that we'll talk about is 302 redirect, temporary redirect. It's very similar in principle to the 301 permanent redirect, but it is temporary rather than permanent. So implications of this, it does not transfer the link value from A to B, whereas a permanent redirect will pass 75 to 90% of that value. The old page is still indexed, and it's still crawled, but will eventually be ignored. And this can be valuable in certain cases. So going back to that e-commerce example, if you have, a product page that is maybe temporarily out of stock and you don't want to get rid of that page altogether, that could be a really good use case for using a temporary redirect. If you have any seasonal or occasion landing pages, maybe, you have a super sale around the Super Bowl, and it's not a page that you need year round, you could redirect that to a different seasonal page if necessary. And then finally, another best practice is to make sure that you're reviewing your 302 redirects on an ongoing basis, and seeing if there's any that could be permanently changed to a 301 redirect if necessary. So the next type of URL status that we'll talk about is the 404 page not found or 410 gone. So anytime you see a 4XX error, it's a client error. It means the page wasn't found and that it couldn't be reached. So there was a request made from the client, but the page was not able to appear on the site in actuality. So some implications of having these error pages. The first one being that the link value, the authority of that page, is not assessed, crawled, found by search engines or humans. The page is not indexed and after a while won't be crawled at all. And then also, it could lead to a high bounce rate and a poor user experience if your internal linking is not updated. I'm sure we've all been on a website where we've clicked on a page and it says 404 error. You're like, and you're frustrated. So it's really important to make sure that any 404 errors that you have on your site, you redirect those to the appropriate page if you have them. So some best practices around this is doing a link reclamation. If you have a 404 error page that maybe had a lot of backlinks pointing to it, this is a really good strategy to try and win some backlinks and improve authority on your website. you'll want to check the link value for pages, see if they received a lot of traffic. And if they did, you'll want to make sure that you redirect it to a similar page. You'll also want to make sure that you remove any 404 error pages from XML sitemaps and make sure that there are no internal links to those pages. So the next type of status code we'll be talking about is a soft 404. So a soft 404 is a page that technically is 200 status, but Google and other crawlers sort of register it as a 404 because they don't see any value on the page. So some implications of this: Google will still crawl and index the page, and the link value is still evaluated, because technically it is a 200 status page, but it's just not providing any value. Eventually, it'll be taken out of the index by Google, but if you have a large quantity of them, that could affect your page authority and also your bounce rate. So some best practices for this, it really is a case-by-case basis. Some examples of where this could happen. Something that we see with a lot of our education clients is they'll have events, academic campus events on a calendar that they'll link to on their website, and then as soon as the event is over, the value of that page is pretty much nothing, right? Like, it's an old event that's already passed. There's no reason for anyone to visit that page anymore. So as a result, those education sites will see a sudden uptick in soft 404 from Google because these pages that were previously valuable, an upcoming calendar event, because it's passed, it's no longer valuable. The content on the page is not enough for Google to see it as a 200 status page. In that case, it is something that you do on a case-by-case basis. So for them, we typically will tell them to just redirect all of those pages back to, the main academic calendar if that event is passed. But in some cases, maybe you want to leave them, just depending on if it's an old event that's valuable. So definitely on a case-by-case basis. The next status code we'll be talking about is 500 internal server errors. Essentially what this means is that there was a request made by the client, but the server failed to complete the request. So slightly different than a 400 error, but still an error nonetheless. The use cases where this might occur, potentially if the server is really overwhelmed, can't handle all of the requests from the browser. We've occasionally seen this when we've tried to crawl client websites using Screaming Frog and the crawl speed is too fast. The server can't handle it. Some implications of this: it does not affect crawling, but it does affect indexation and rankings are affected almost immediately. So if you've got a page where the server can't handle all the different requests, it'll actually just completely fall out of the index. So if this happens, some best practices: try to use 503 Unavailable instead, which we'll talk about on the next slide, or reduce the server downtime and email the client and let them know that the server is down and it needs to be fixed on their end. So the final status code we'll be talking about is 503 Unavailable. It's very similar to a 500 status code, but a 503 response means that the server is unavailable, and search engines and humans are asked to come back later. So basically, this means that maybe the server is temporarily overloaded or there's maintenance going on, and it does not affect crawling, although it would eventually affect indexation and rank. So try to use this over 500, but minimize downtime of the server if you can. So next, we're going to be talking about directives and tags. So the first directive we're going to be talking about is the noindex tag. So the noindex tag does pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It tells search engines not to index a page. So search engines can still crawl and find the page, and any links that might be on it, but basically the noindex tag is telling search engines like Google, not to put this page in the index in the search engine results. A use case of this might be if there's something that you don't want to show up. So, for example, if you have an e-commerce site and you've got a shopping cart, where people are putting their product in the cart, that's an example of a page that you wouldn't actually want to show up in the index because there's no real search engine value of that page. It's mainly transactional. It's something that people need to use on the site, but it's not valuable from an SEO or search perspective. So as far as best practices, if you're going to put a no index on a page, make sure you don't put it in the XML sitemap. So calling back to something I mentioned earlier, if you have a no index tag, but you also have it in the XML sitemap, you're sending contradictory signals to search engines about the value and the point of the page. So make sure that, you don't have it in there. And you'll want to use this for any page that you don't want indexed. So on an e-commerce site, that might be a shopping cart page. Maybe if you're a bank or something and you've got an account page where people can log in, don't put a no index tag on that page. Anything that doesn't provide search engine value. So the next tag that we'll talk about is the canonical tag. A canonical tag tells search engines the authoritative version of a page. So the purpose of doing this is to try and, remedy duplicate content. You can use a canonical tag to tell search engines, which page is the most authoritative version, which page you want all of the equity to flow to. So an example of when you might use a canonical tag, let's say that on your site you've got different versions of the URL. So maybe it's an e-commerce page and it's for shirts, and one of the features of the page is that you can filter the shirts by size, by color, and every time you do that, there are parameters that show up on the end of the URL. But essentially, it's all the same content, right? It's just filtering the shirts in different ways. But even though it's creating different URLs, the most authoritative version of that page is still, store.com/shirts. So best practices, use this for duplicate content. So if there's any URL parameters that are created, make sure that you have a canonical version of the main content that you want all of the equity to go to. Another example of this is maybe if you have paginated content, like on a blog or something, and you've got a blog and it's like /page 2, page 3, ultimately the canonical version of it is just the main blog page. So the content does need to be similar for the canonical tag to work. So Google can penalize you if you just have a bunch of pages that are canonically linked to a different page that doesn't actually match the intent of the page. So you can't just blanket canonical a bunch of pages to one because you want them to have more equity. And then finally, you'll want to make sure that you don't include any pages that are canonically linked to another page within the XML sitemap. Only the most authoritative canonical version of the page should be in the XML sitemap. So then finally, the last directive we'll talk about is the Nofollow tag. So essentially, you will put this on internal or external links on a page, and it tells search engines not to crawl that link. And it actually prevents equity from flowing from your content to the content that you're linking to. Some use cases for this. Many popular news publications will include nofollow links on their comment sections because they've had issues with people hopping in there and linking to their website, basically spamming the comments and trying to get backlink juice back to their website because they've commented on a really high domain authority website like the New York Times. As a result, high domain authority publications like that now have nofollow links on their comment section, so you can't just comment on a popular article and expect to receive sort of backlink credit for it. And another best practice is anywhere that you might want to preserve crawl allotment. Maybe you've got a certain web page that you have a lot of links on there, and you want to make sure that search engines are only crawling the most important pages on your website. So you have no follow links on all of the links on a particular page. An example of this might be maybe you have an article about, it's like a resource guide, and you link out to a bunch of different external resources, um, and you don't want search engines to crawl and find all of those. Great. So that was the crawl errors and status code training. Thanks for listening. Have a good rest of your day.